Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the National Conference of State Legislatures and the Pew Charitable Trusts for this webinar on federal spending in the states. My name is Anna Petrini, and I'm with the Fiscal Affairs Program at the National Conference of State Legislatures. I'll be serving as the moderator of today's webinar. As a reminder, for best results with the audio portion of this webinar, we encourage you to use the unique telephone dial-in information contained in the registration email you received. Next slide. The National Conference of State Legislatures is pleased to partner with the Pew Charitable Trusts to bring this webinar to you. In case you're not familiar with NCSL, we are a bipartisan organization that serves the legislators and legislative staffs of the nation's 50 states, its commonwealths, and territories. NCSL provides research, testimony, and opportunities for policymakers to exchange ideas on pressing state policy issues. State fiscal issues fall primarily within the jurisdiction of two NCSL standing committees, the Committee on Budgets and Revenue and the Labor and Economic Development Committee. NCSL's standing committees allow legislators and legislative staff to share state experiences in shaping public policy and managing the legislative institution. They meet twice a year at the NCSL Legislative Summit and the NCSL Forum. For more information on these meetings, or NCSL's activities and services to legislators and legislative staff, please visit our website at www.ncsl.org. The purpose of this jointly sponsored webinar is to introduce Pew's new 50-state analysis of federal spending, which is designed to fill in the significant data gap that was left when the U.S. Census Bureau discontinued its Consolidated Federal Funds Report in 2012. After we hear from our presenter, we will open the discussion to include questions from the audience. To ask questions, you can simply type a question in the Q&A box in the right-hand corner of your screen. Now I will turn the program over to Ann Stouffer at Pew Charitable Trust. Ann directs Pew's work on fiscal federalism, and she directed this project. She will share a few words before her colleague, Sam Rosen, begins his presentation. Welcome, Ann.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you all for joining us today. It's been great to see how enthusiastically our report has been received by policymakers, their staff, and the media. Clearly, more and more observers are understanding that what you already know, which is that federal budget policy has significant impacts on the states, and that 50 state data are critical to tracking those impacts. In addition to national news stories, the report has been getting a lot of coverage in states from Oregon to Maine, and including New Mexico, Louisiana, Maryland, Illinois, D.C., and others. So being able to tell the state story is important, and being able to tell the story of the impact on states to national policymakers is also important. That's why we worked hard to pull this data together, and we hope that it will help you as you work with your agencies and your federal delegations. As Anna mentioned, Sam Rosen is our lead researcher on this project, and as you can see from his bio on the screen, which is coming up, he has experience in tracking federal funds. So I'm going to hand this over to Sam.
Thanks, Ann. I appreciate the introduction. Again, I'm Sam Rosen. I'm a researcher here at the Pew Charitable Trusts. I want to first thank NCSL for having us on this webinar today. We're very happy to be talking to state policymakers about our new report. I also want to thank those who reviewed our report and methodology, which includes staff from Federal Funds Information for States, the state associations, also several federal agencies. Their comments were very constructive, and we really appreciate the help. So today I'll be talking about our recent report, Federal Spending in the States, which, as mentioned, replaces a former federal report known as the Consolidated Federal Funds Report, or the CFFR, which some of you might be familiar with. Let me first give you a rundown of what we'll be talking about today. First, I'm going to give a brief history of the former federal report. I'll then walk through our report and talk about what we found. And I'll wrap it up by talking about the methodology behind the report and take any questions you might have. Okay, so why did we release this report? Our release fills a significant data gap in understanding how federal budget changes affect the states. The federal government spends more than $3 trillion a year in the states. But until we did this report, there is no single data source showing how federal dollars are currently spent in each state. Our report fills that gap. This data provides policymakers at all levels of government an important picture of how federal spending is distributed across the country and helps them to understand the impact of federal budget and policy decisions. Previously, there had been a federal report that provided this data. So for every year from 1982 through 2012, the Census Bureau produced the CFFR. It collected information on federal spending in the states across 5 categories. Retirement benefits, which include Social Security and federal pensions. Non-retirement benefits, which include Medicare and unemployment. Grants, which include grants to state and local governments for things such as healthcare, education, and transportation. It also includes some grants to individuals. Federal contracts, and then the final category is salaries and wages for federal employees in the states. This data has been widely used by every level of government, as well as by researchers and policy analysts across the country. However, Census canceled the CFFR in 2012, meaning the last data we have is for fiscal year 2010. In other words, the last official data on federal spending in the states is now a full 4 fiscal years old. And without it, there's no central place to find the distribution of federal spending in the states. Our new report fills that gap, providing new data to replace the lost information from the CFFR. So let me highlight our key findings. First, overall, the federal government spends more than $3 trillion a year in the states. This represents about 91% of total federal spending. The remaining 9% is spent on interest payment on the debt, loans, some foreign spending, as well as classified expenditures. So here's how that $3 trillion in spending in the states was broken out for federal fiscal year 2013, which is the last year we had complete data for. Throughout our report, we used the same 5 spending categories as was in the CFFR. As you can see, retirement and non-retirement benefits for individuals are more than half of the federal spending in the states. Again, this includes spending such as Social Security, Medicare, unemployment insurance, and food stamps. In our report, we also provide a look at how this data has changed over time. We've used our methodology to go back through federal fiscal year 2004, which gives us 10 years of spending data. In this chart, we can see that while federal spending in the states has been falling since the recession, as shown in the top orange line, this is not always the case for every spending category. Indeed, retirement benefits, again, Social Security and federal pensions, which are shown here in the dark blue line, have been steadily growing, even after you adjust for inflation. Now, let's dive deeper and look at our results state by state. In our research, we found that national averages really don't tell you the whole story. Instead, there's so much variation in the level, in the mix of federal spending from state to state. So full 50-state data is really key. With the 50-state data, though, it's critical to use metrics that allow you to make apples-to-apples comparisons. For example, obviously, there's likely to be more federal spending in states with a larger population, but the total dollar figure doesn't allow you to compare the relative importance of federal spending in each state. So in our report, we decided to show the state-by-state spending in terms of state economic activity, or its gross domestic product, GDP. This is a new feature that was not in the original CFFR report. As you can see in the map, we found that overall, in FY 2013, federal spending was equivalent to about 1/5 of state economic activity. But the map also shows there's a really great deal of variation state to state. Federal spending ranged from about 12% in Wyoming to 33% in Mississippi. You actually notice in the key, the top value goes up to 42%, This is because of the District of Columbia. It has such a large federal presence that federal spending in the district is equivalent to 42% of its GDP. So it's a significant outlier here. This map shows how useful the state GDP comparison is. For example, in dollar terms, California receives 10 times more federal spending than Iowa. But when you control for the differences in the size of the state's economies, you find that the federal spending really plays a similar role in each state. In this case, it is equivalent to about 16% of economic activity in both California and Iowa. This is a really great example of how using GDP is a useful yardstick to compare the relative role of federal spending in each state, and lets you make an apples-to-apples comparison. In addition to the variation in overall spending levels, our second big finding was that the composition of federal spending varies widely across the states. So in this chart, we show the federal spending in each state, again relative to the state's GDP, but broken down by our 5 spending categories. For this chart, we selected just a handful of the states with the highest and lowest ratios to make it a little bit easier to see the states. But in our full report, which is available on our website, we provide a full 50-state breakdown along with downloadable tables of our state spending data. The main point to take away here is that each state has its own unique mix of federal spending. For example, overall, federal spending in Virginia and New Mexico, which are highlighted here, it plays a similar role in the state economy. But in Virginia, contract spending, in light green, is more prominent, while in New Mexico, it's grants money, which is in dark green, that's more prominent in comparison. What that means is that if the federal government were to cut federal contracts, hypothetically, that could have a bigger impact on Virginia's economy. But if grants reform were on the table, that could have a bigger impact on New Mexico. So it's important for states and federal policymakers to have access to federal spending data such as this so they can fully understand each state's relationship with the federal government, really especially given the changes in federal spending that we've seen over the past 10 years. So finally, I wanted to tell you a little bit about our methodology. As I mentioned before, the CFFR has been incredibly useful for a variety of users. So in setting out to recreate it, we had a couple of goals. First, we wanted to approximate the spending levels as much as we could. We also wanted this to be as straightforward for other people to recreate and update, so we wanted to use only publicly available federal data sets and keep the number manipulating to a minimum. In the recreation, we relied primarily on a handful of federal data sets, and most of our data come from just 2 sources, usaspending.gov and the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which produces state personal income data. The first data set, usaspending.gov, is the federal government spending transparency website. It shows contract and grant information down to the street level. Some of you might be familiar with this site since it is known for having some data quality issues. But we've minimized the data problems by first aggregating the information up to the state level. In a second, we avoid the data fields with the highest error rates, such as the street address and the project description. And third, we don't use usaspending.gov's payments to individuals data, which the Government Accountability Office identified as having the most data quality problems. Instead, for these data, we bring in the second set from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. This data set, while somewhat less well known, it shows us the various sources of income that people earn in the different states. And for our purposes, we use this data for 3 of the spending categories: retirement and non-retirement benefits to individuals, and then salaries and wages for federal employees. Using these 2 data sets, and we bring in a couple others to make some minor adjustments, we came remarkably close to reproducing the spending levels in the CFFR. For FY 2010, which is the last year we have CFFR data, the spending in our recreation was equal to 99% of the CFFR. As you can see, we also overlap with the CFFR for the last 7 years. And then we're able to extend the data out to fiscal year 2013, so we had 3 years of data beyond what the CFFR had. I should also mention that we're going to be updating this report annually, so we'll be able to extend it in the future. So we're really excited to be able to share this report and our project with you today, which shows the distribution of federal spending in the states. Again, this data can help states better understand their relationship with the federal government and provide important context for understanding the impact that federal policy can have on the states. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you have about our findings, our report, or the methodology. So thank you.
Thank you, Sam. As he said, at this time we're happy to take your questions. Again, to ask a question, please type it into the Q&A box in the right-hand corner of your screen. Your question will not be visible to everyone, only to the webinar administrators. We will take as many questions as possible within the time available. As we are waiting for your questions, I want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be archived on the NCSL website.
Okay, so this is we have one question coming in that says the variation state by state is really interesting. Do you know what drives that variation?
Sure, it's a good question. So in any state, the amount of federal spending will be driven by a variety of factors, such as each state's demographics, its mix of industries, and other factors that might drive federal spending in that state. The main point is we're providing this data so we can help the federal and state policymakers understand each state's unique relationship in their own areas. As I said, what's clear is that the national numbers don't tell the whole story here. So it's really important for every state to understand their own mix of the spending to help understand that relationship.
Then we have another question about the Data Act and whether the Data Act will help provide more data for this kind of report going forward.
Sure. So the Data Act, which I believe passed earlier this year, will help to standardize some aspects of federal spending as it's enacted in the coming years. However, at this time it seems unlikely that it will be providing additional geographics of federal spending information beyond what is currently available, such as from USA Spending and the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So that remains to be seen.
And then we have another question. It says that it looks like the grants category where Medicaid is going down. Is the Medicaid expansion showing up in these numbers?
That's a good question. So most of the Medicaid expansion spending will be showing up actually in the next year, in federal fiscal year 2014. So a handful of states did expand their Medicaid programs earlier. So some of that would be reflected in our data, but that's really a state-by-state question. But as I said, most of it and most of the rest of the Affordable Care Act spending will be showing up in our 2014 data.
So we have a question that says, this data reflects a 12 to 18th month data lag. How can this help to project fiscal year 2015 spending, federal fiscal year 2015 spending?
Well, so we like to say here at Pew, we don't have a crystal ball for looking into the future. These spending levels are always, so it's up to Congress and the federal policymakers to set the various federal spending levels. So we do make all of our data available. We are showing the 10-year trend to help give states a better idea of what's going on in their state, and like I said, to help that relationship provide data and illuminate the picture of where they are now and where they've been to help give them the tools that they need for making policy choices.
So a follow-up question to that is that do you have the 10-year data available for individual states?
Yeah, actually we do. So you can contact us, and our information will be up on the screen again in a minute. So we do have 10-year historical data for the 5 spending categories, again for 10 years for every state, and we're happy to pass that out so you can really dive in to see what's going on in your state.
Okay, then we have another question coming in about the CFFR. You had data that went down to the county level. Does this report have that as well?
Sure. So it's correct. The original CFFR did provide county-level data by the 5 categories. So our state provides it down to the state level, and it's really because of a question of data availability. As I mentioned before, the Government Accountability Office, the federal office, found that USAspending.gov, for example, had serious data quality issues when you go below the state level, trying to assign where are the different, for instance, federal projects by city or county. So that's one issue when you're going below just the state level. And then the state personal income data that we're getting from the Bureau of Economic Analysis sometimes isn't available for certain localities. So if we could, we'd love to go down deeper into each state and provide that level of information. But until the data improves, we're really just working with a 50-state picture here.
So one of the questions that came in is, in future annual reports, will the impacts of ARA and sequestration be discussed?
So the main point we're giving across here is we're providing the information for states to show what's been going on in their state. So we're providing the information so they can have a better understanding of their relationship with the federal government. Some policy areas, some of the spending levels were changed by things like the recession and the Recovery Act from that. You can see in our 10-year chart, for instance, the grant spending did go up as a result of there's a large amount of federal grants to states in as a result of the stimulus spending. Additionally, there's an increase in unemployment insurance. So you see the non-retirement benefits going up as a result of the recession and the stimulus spending. But some categories were not as much affected by that, say the retirement spending, which kind of is on a constant increase. So it's a good question.
So are there any more questions? So if you have any more questions after this webinar ends and you want to contact us, the information is up on the screen. We really appreciate your interest and attention to this report that we released, and we hope, again, that it's useful to you as you look ahead and try to do your projections and think about the impact of federal spending on your state. So that concludes the Pew portion. I don't know if Anna at NCSL wants to say anything before we sign off.
No, thank you all so much for joining us.
All right. Thanks.